Welcome dog lovers. Thanks for checking in. Today I'm going to take you through a short 20-minute video blast sharing all the fundamentals and foundations about fear in dogs. We're going to look at what fear is, what fear isn't, and what we can do about it if our dog is struggling to cope with a wide number of fears. So grab yourself a drink and a snack and we'll get started. So in the last video we spent 20 minutes or so thinking about anxiety, and you can find a link to that in the description section below. But I'm just going to recap briefly before we start as we unroll, because it's going to be really important to understand the difference between fear and anxiety, because that may involve different treatments, it may involve different management strategies at time, it will also involve different training plans, and as an adjunct to that it may involve different medications too. So anxiety is apprehension. It's an anticipatory feeling that happens even when there's nothing dangerous or threatening around. It's a largely mental process that doesn't have clear bookends, if you like, that mark off when it should start and what might bring it to a close. Anxiety is also uncertainty arriving from incomplete information. Fear, in comparison, comes as a response to the bad stuff. That's the key word right there. Fear is a response. It's also, as anxiety is, normal. Fear has physiological, emotional, cognitive and behavioural elements just as anxiety does, but these differ between the two states. Anxiety doesn't activate the sympathetic nervous system in the same way and to the same extent as fear does. That's our fight or flight system. That means we don't get the full flight or flight response as we would if we were afraid, but anxiety does prime us for it. Anxiety also involves anticipation rather than response. It makes us vigilant, and it also involves avoidance rather than escape behaviours. So, fear activates the sympathetic nervous system, it causes us to respond to environmental stimuli, and it involves escape behaviours. Fear is also normal, as is anxiety, and a degree of fear helps us function. We might not be on the Serengeti being stalked by lions, but heightened emotions are actually good for learning a memory. This is one reason why stuff is easier to recall if it was fun, if it was exciting, if it was novel, or if it was frightening. It's also why third year algebra not quite so memorable. Within that spectrum of normality, there will also be those who respond more quickly and those who respond more slowly. And we call this latency. You know, latency, right? We have it with our internet speeds. Low latency means your web pages load quickly and stuff happens rapidly. You can download things quickly, you can upload things quickly. High latency means that your web pages are slow, that there's a long lag or delay, and like the internet speeds, our nerves are just exactly the same. So some of us live on our nerves and we've got very low latency, and a fear response can happen much more quickly as a response. And we would say there our fear has low latency. Others are very chilled out and have got a high latency. So which one's best for an antelope on the Serengeti? A stock market dealer, a 100-meter runner? Low latency is great until it means that you're living on your nerves. Anxiety can play a part in lowering our latency as well. It primes us to respond to danger quickly. It puts us on the starting blocks, if you like, so we're waiting for the starter pistol instead of leaving us on the concourse in the queue waiting for nachos and beer. So you'll see here that anxiety can sensitise us to danger. So sensitisation is an important process. It's one that people with reactive dogs and people working with reactive dogs really need to understand, and we're going to come back to it many times. But anxiety plays a significant role in sensitisation, as does excitement and even euphoria. A fear response isn't just about how quickly we respond to danger or threat, but also how much exposure to the threat it takes. So for some of us, a tiny amount of whatever provokes our fear response is more than enough. For others, we're going to need quite a lot before it causes us to move. So, you know, for some of us, a tiny amount of something is enough to cause a reaction. For others, we're going to need a lot. Back to our antelope on the Serengeti plains, some antelope are going to be responding to the slightest whiff of a predator. Others are going to need much more than that to cause a fight or flight response. Our reactions also vary in intensity. Some of us are going to have much bigger and more dramatic responses to situations. Others of us are going to have much smaller responses. So my brother told me this week about a poor man at his company who they'd interviewed, and he'd actually passed out during the interview. I mean, that's a huge fear response there. So when I have interviews, I might have a few butterflies. In fact, that little bit of pre-interview anticipation and anxiety is actually going to enhance my performance. But those butterflies probably won't be visible to anybody other than myself. So if you see a lion on the Serengeti, are you walking or are you running? Because there's a big difference in intensity there. And our reactions also take different times to subside between us as individuals. So the duration of our responses can also vary. Some of us are going to feel the aftermath for a very long time, and it may take us a long time to reset. Others are going to be doing something else in seconds. Latency, the amount of exposure required, intensity of response and duration are all ways that we can consider if a dog's response is normal or abnormal. For instance, if our reactive dog's fear responses have got low latency, so they happen really quickly, they need low amounts of exposure, they're barking at a dog 300 meters away, they've got high intensity, they're lunging and barking, right straight away, and they've got long duration, they last long after the dog's disappeared into the distance. We may want to think about speaking to our vet to see if we can reduce any aspects of this. So we might not be able to do much about latency and amount of exposure with medication, but we can with training. But there are medications that will help reduce the intensity and duration of a response. When we're working to understand our reactive dogs, it's really important to understand that their responses may vary into each category. So for instance, my dog Liddy had behaviours that were quick, they needed very little exposure, her behaviours were of high intensity, and actually they subsided really quickly. So I remember one time when I was walking her, we were set upon by a Barky Spaniel, and for me it was hair raising, literally for her it was. But while I was still recovering, she'd gone back to sniffing the verges and looking for wildlife, and I was still there panicking about this Barky Spaniel that had been off lead and just kind of running around. Training has helped raise the latency of her behaviour, it's made it slower, and it's helped also increase the amount of exposure that she can cope with before she sets about having a reaction. Her behaviours are still pretty explosive, but training has helped with that too. So we've increased the latency, more lag, and we've increased the amount of exposure she needs before she'll react, and we've decreased the intensity and the duration, but her recovery time is still pretty much the same. It was pretty good to start with. So my other dog, he has pretty high latency of behaviour. He needs quite a lot of exposure and has got low intensity behaviour. So he'll still be thinking about growling by the time Liddy's lunged at someone. But he's like me though, he takes a little bit of time to reset afterwards. So understanding our dogs' individual profiles is crucial. So often when we're working with reactive dogs, we're trying to work on all 5 of those things at the same time. So I'd say pick one and work on that. Pick off the worst thing and make that your focus, and you'll also see the other shifting too. So if you've got a dog who needs very little exposure, a very, very far distance, then that will be the thing that was working on. It may be also that you've got very quick, you've got low latency, you've got very quick behaviours, might be a thing that you were working on as well. But what you'll see is that the other things will shift too. But I would say don't try and focus on everything, and remember to break the behaviour down. So in future videos, we're going to look at the physiological, emotional, cognitive and behavioural aspects of reactive behaviour. Suffice to say that for now, it's an event with 2 parts. So one of these parts we already know, that's the response. So this is the behaviour, what the dog actually does. But it's also the emotion, how the dog feels. And it's the physiology, what happens in the animal's body. So the other part of this is what's known in scientific terms as the stimulus, the cause, the trigger. So without the stimulus, there's no response. We're not always running away from lions if there are no lions to run away from. Without the stimulus, we're still in a world of anxiety. We might be worried that there are lions and prepared to run away, but we're still not primed. We're primed for it, but we're not ready yet to run away until the lion gets there. So the stimulus is very much about what's the cause of the behaviour, what's the reason that the behaviour starts. Sometimes the behaviour that we see from our dogs, like in this video here, is actually more fitting of anxiety. So you're just watching a video of Liddy, and Heston's going to come in shortly. It's a snake skin that we'd found. As you can see, Liddy's behaviour varies between approach, and there we go, we got backing off, so she retreats, and she's trying to get more information. She's actually looking at me for my response as well, and then she's coming forward as well. But a natural instinct is to actually recoil from it and to back off. So we see this behaviour a lot with reactive dogs, this ambivalence, this approach, which we've got here, an approach there, not a reactive dog. It's like, can I eat it? No. Maybe another little look at it. Nope, still not interested in that much in it, but you can see Lydia this approach and this highly cautious behaviour, and then the backing off again. And actually, I think she's there. Look for the exit. So what you see here is something that's really interesting about fears. So in the 1980s, research psychologist Susan Minecka started to investigate fears in animals and how quickly they were learned. And what she found was something that there are things called fear relevant stimuli. That's something that we're going to discuss a lot in future videos. So why, for instance, for Liddy, is this snake skin something that she's really not certain about at all? See, I would put this in the anxiety side of things. You know, she's got incomplete information. She's trying to gather that information, isn't she? She's like, I'm not sure about it. I should be afraid of this. And Heston's just like, okay, I'm not very interested in this at all. More interested in whether I've got a biscuit or not. You can see how relaxed he is. And yeah, he's coming again, you know, he's curious about it, but there's a difference between his curiosity and her fearfulness. Okay. So as you can see, it's really not fear versus anxiety, but there is a difference between the two. The fundamental difference for me between fear and anxiety is that we can use exposure therapies with the fears. That means we can do all the gradual exposure that we would normally do as part of a treatment with a dog. We can use lots of other processes as well, things that we're going to explore as lighten up unrolls. Anxiety, whilst it may involve the expectation of certain things that cause dogs to feel afraid, but it may depend in part on these same processes, but it won't really depend on them entirely. We're going to need to do something different with dogs who are anxious compared to dogs who feel afraid. So knowing if your dog is anxious because they're expecting to encounter one of these nasty things, or whether they're just simply afraid when they do, that helps us understand what kind of strategies will work with our dogs. And it's one reason, for instance, that I've never thought to use anti-anxiety medications with Liddy, because she doesn't really seem to have that expectation or anticipation of threat or danger. You know, there is a stimulus there, the snake skin, and she's responding to it with ambivalence and not quite sure about what to do about it. But that's a fear response. It's not altering her behaviour. She's not behaving like that when there's nothing around. She only behaved like that because the snake skin was there. And that's why when we're thinking about medications with our vet, we really need to understand whether it's a response to something or whether it's something, you know, that kind of more mental process that anxiety needs to be. Because if we're working with fear behaviours or very strong responses to fear, as we see, not a strong response to fear there from her, but it's different than Heston's response where he's not that interested in it. That's going to affect the kind of things that we might be talking to our vet about, because to use anti-anxiety medications on her may not make that much of a significant difference to her behaviour, and especially if it's involving mental processes. And where we've got those strong fear responses, that's another time that we're going to need to explain to the vet that this is only happening in the presence of these certain stimuli, maybe a lot of stimuli. There are some dogs that are afraid of lots and lots of things, but in between, even if they're not recovering very well, they don't seem to have those that same vigilance. You know, she's now just lying on the couch, she's relaxed, she's not constantly on the lookout for snake skins or whatever else of the things that she's afraid of. In between, we have those moments of relaxation, and those are things that will help a vet make a decision about which kind of medication will be useful for our dogs, and it will help our behaviourist or our trainer make sense of what kind of behaviour programs will work with the dog and what kind of things will be best suited for them. promised you a few weeks ago that I'd give you a definition of reactive behaviour that was rooted in emotions like fear and anxiety, because of course we've got different reasons for reactive behaviour. And I'm going to say that you do not have to wait much longer, lovely people. So in the next video, I'm going to introduce you to an analogy that explains anxious and fearful behaviour, and it just explains it so perfectly for me. And while it doesn't help us understand some of the other factors that underpin reactive behaviour, I certainly hope that it's going to help you understand what's happening with some reactive dogs at the very least. What it won't necessarily do is help us understand impulsivity and predation or frustration or territorial behaviours, but it will help us understand in particular anxiety and fearfulness. So peace out, lovely dog people. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to help me share the message, and like the video if you found it useful, and then maybe other people will discover it too. Thanks for watching.